So today I want to focus on the entry on forgiveness that's found in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's a free online resource, and it's actually very, very good, and it's obviously written from the perspective of philosophy. It's also, I think, really quite useful because it gives us an overview of the various approaches that scholars take to the topic of forgiveness. As we'll quickly find out, there is an enormous amount of literature on the topic of forgiveness, and not everybody is saying the same thing, right? There are some really, really smart people who've thought long and hard about the topic of forgiveness, and they don't all say the same thing. In fact, sometimes they disagree about some basic issues. So this article, I think, gives us a nice overview of those different approaches, which I think will be helpful as we begin to dig into more deeply some of the books that we'll be looking at this fall. It'll help clarify, right? This person sort of falls into this approach, so that we can sort of understand things a little more quickly. I think it also will give us an ability to make some judgments about the strengths and weaknesses of the particular approaches, and also help us as we, maybe through the fall, start to form our own thoughts about what we think forgiveness is, and see, where we fall on the spectrum of forgiveness. This is great, right? It makes for a really good conversation when not everybody agrees, and it also says, well, I'm going to be in good company no matter where I fall along the spectrum of approaches. So, as I said, I'm going to try to summarize some of the major points that are found in this entry on forgiveness in the Stanford Encyclopedia. I'm not going to try to do everything. I'm going to kind of focus on the ones that I think are important for us. I'll maybe mention some of the other stuff. So the first critical distinction to make is the distinction between interpersonal forgiveness and divine forgiveness, right? So interpersonal forgiveness is the way in which human beings forgive one another, right? It's between people. And divine forgiveness is about how God forgives human beings. So the Stanford entry is really primarily about interpersonal forgiveness, the way in which human beings forgive one another. It has a few paragraphs on divine forgiveness. So what I'm going to do is just put that to one side. It's a really, really important topic. And when we get to reading Anthony Bash, who is a theologian, he talks quite a bit about divine forgiveness, or the way God forgives. So we'll just put that to one side. But we should recognize that what's going on in the approaches that we're looking at is really mainly talking about interpersonal forgiveness, the forgiveness that we find between two people, or between people. So, which leads us to this sort of first effort to describe or define forgiveness that we find in the piece. And so the focus of the entry is going to be on forgiveness as a response to wrongdoing. That is, the real focus of these theories is how human beings respond to a moral wrong that is done to them. So we can use the term, the word forgiveness maybe a bit too loosely sometimes, where I think it mentions, I need to forgive that musician for a terrible performance. But the theories really aren't kind of talking about forgiveness in that sense. They're talking about forgiveness as a response to moral wrongdoing, harm that's done to us. And it's not just any harm, right? Because I could be walking along and I could stub my toe on a rock, and that would hurt really badly, and I could, I'm really angry, and I might, say some off-color things or something like that. But that's really not a case where I need to like forgive the rock, right? That's just something that harmed me, and I got angry and upset, but it kind of would make no sense to say that I needed to forgive the rock for the harm that was done to me. Now, I guess if somebody put that rock there with the intention of tripping me up and harming me, then we're in the realm of forgiveness, right? Because there was an intention to do harm by another moral agent, and that's wrong. So then I would have to figure out what I'm going to do. So forgiveness, in the sense in which the authors that we're looking at and this entry has to do with a response to moral wrongdoing. And so in this sense, according to the entry, forgiveness sets up a dyadic relationship. That is, a relationship between a wrongdoer and someone who is the victim of wrongdoing. I don't know if that's the best language, but it's the language they use, right? Wrongdoer and victim, but you get the picture. And what forgiveness does, according to this piece, is a way in which the victim of wrongdoing alters their status as well as the status of the wrongdoer. And we're going to look at the ways in which different theories think about that altered status that takes place in the process of forgiveness. So I think an important section in this entry is on cognate phenomena. That is, big words, right? What this section tries to do is distinguish forgiveness from other ideas or notions or actions that often get confused with forgiveness. So it's really important to try to clarify what forgiveness is and what forgiveness is not. So the first cognate phenomenon that the entry looks at is justification, right? And what justification is about is when some action initially appears to be wrong, but it turns out that it was not, right? So the author uses an example, right? I see a person take an apple from a fruit stand and eat it, right? And I think, oh, that person is stealing apples or something like that. So, but when I confront that person, he explains to me, well, I own that fruit stand, and so I have every right to take the fruit and eat it, right? So in this case, what I thought was morally wrong was not, right? So the action is justified, and it is not, it's not forgiven because it's not morally wrong, right? When we're talking about justification, there really is nothing to forgive. So that's different from forgiveness because forgiveness has to do with actions that are morally wrong. And when we get a sufficient justification for something that initially appears to be wrong, we say, that wasn't wrong. There's a justification for that action, and then there's nothing to forgive. So that's different from forgiveness. The second one, cognate phenomenon that the entry looks at is excuse, right? Sometimes things are done which are in fact wrong, but for which people aren't morally blameworthy, right? Okay, to take the fruit stand example again, right? Suppose someone takes an apple from another person's fruit stand and eats it. Okay, so in this case, that person didn't have a right to take the fruit from that stand and eat it. But when we confront the person or talk to the person about that action, we realize he legitimately thought it was his own fruit stand, that he was mistaken, and he thought he was taking his own fruit when in fact he was taking someone else's fruit. So he has a legitimate excuse, right? So it was morally wrong to take the fruit and eat it, when it didn't belong to him. But he was mistaken. He really thought it was his own, so he has a legitimate excuse. He's not morally blameworthy, right? So you can think of a lot of examples of this, right? For example, if I'm backing up and I, accidentally stomp down on someone's toe, that is, stepping on someone's toe and hurting them is not a good thing. But I didn't intend to do it. It was an accident. I backed into them. So legitimate excuse means that I am not morally blameworthy for something that is wrong. It shouldn't have happened, but I don't have blame in a moral sense for that because I have a legitimate excuse. Now, that's different. Excusing morally wrong behavior is one thing. Forgiveness means that the person who did that act is also morally blameworthy. So when we excuse an act, we're not forgiving someone because we're saying, he has a legitimate excuse, he or she is not morally blameworthy. But when we forgive someone, we are indeed saying the action was wrong and the person is indeed morally blameworthy. Okay? So a third cognate phenomenon is pardon. And so pardon, at least in this entry, is usually referring to officially nullifying a punishment for a crime that is usually granted by an authority in government or the executive branch or something like that, right? And this is typically exercised by some third party, right? Think of the pardon of President Nixon, right? And so pardon generally is distinguished from forgiveness for a couple of reasons, because forgiveness is generally not thought to be something that third parties can do. That is, there was a harm done to another person. I'm a third party outside of that. I don't kind of get to say one person is forgiven or not. That's really something that happens in that dyadic relationship. And the other thing to note is that a pardon is usually kind of in a relationship where there's a power imbalance. It's usually done by someone who has some kind of political authority and can say, based on the power that I have in my office, I can pardon you for your offense. Now, forgiveness doesn't necessarily have that power relationship because I could be, a little guy. I am a little guy, and I might feel I need to forgive someone who has power over me. It would be kind of weird to say that, I'm a little guy, I'm going to pardon you. What would that really mean, right? And the other thing that kind of distinguishes pardon from forgiveness is that you can pardon someone without forgiving them, right? You can pardon someone, again, I think like Nixon, for politically expedient reasons, right? But you can still say, I don't forgive the guy, but for reasons of getting on with the business of the government or something like that, I just have to pardon them. But I haven't forgiven them. So it makes, you might want to also forgive them, but you can see the difference between forgiveness and pardon. Another cognate phenomenon is mercy, which is a lot like pardon in certain ways. That is, mercy is often offered by a third party, again, maybe someone, again, who has a certain kind of imbalance of power relationship over someone. And the example that the entry gives is of a boss who doesn't fire an employee who told an off-color joke in the lunchroom, right? And the boss had every right to fire the person. But instead of doing that, the boss is merciful and talks to the person and says, that's really inappropriate, but you can keep your job. So the boss exercises mercy there. He or she wasn't in the presence when the joke got told, so it wasn't kind of directly harming them. So they're kind of a third person and they have power. Again, think about, as a little guy, I might want to forgive someone who has power over me. But it would be kind of hard to say as a little guy, I want to show mercy to someone. Mercy really kind of has this imbalanced relationship. So again, forgiveness usually is not a third-party thing, and it doesn't depend on this asymmetrical power relationship that mercy often does. So another cognate phenomenon is reconciliation, right? And reconciliation is the restoration of a relationship that has been broken by forgiveness. Now, forgiveness may lead to reconciliation, but it need not always end up with reconciliation, right? And as the author mentions, sometimes reconciliation may actually be unwise, right? It's, for example, it could be, I could forgive a person who's abusive, but it may be unwise to seek reconciliation because it just opens me up to more harm, right? So forgiveness is different than reconciliation because sometimes I can forgive, but reconciliation may be unwise. Sometimes we actually might want to reconcile with someone and they don't want to reconcile with us. So I can forgive them. I might even want to be reconciled, but they might say, no way, don't want it. So again, reconciliation is different from forgiveness that way. And sometimes people think that reconciliation is just practically impossible, right? It may be, I might feel a need to forgive someone and I might want to reconcile with them, but I might not know where they are. They could be halfway around the world. They might have done something to me and I never really kind of figured out who that person was, so it would be kind of impractical to reconcile. Or a case that's often brought up is reconciliation with someone who has died, right? Oftentimes we feel like we need to forgive someone who's harmed us, but they're dead. Can we reconcile with them? Maybe not this, maybe not in this earthly life. Maybe in heavenly life. That's at least a hope. And so it's important to see a distinction between forgiveness and reconciliation because oftentimes it is possible to forgive someone but not also be reconciled with them. Okay? And the last sort of cognate phenomenon that I want to mention that the article mentions is condonation. It's a big word. Actually, it's a little trickier section, so I don't want to get into it too deeply, but it's essentially how oftentimes people will end up condoning wrongdoing, right? And so basically what this says is that something is done that is morally wrong, okay? So we're beginning with that forgiveness is about a moral wrong. Some people in their response to moral wrongdoing will tolerate that wrongdoing and even minimize that wrongdoing, right? Think about, people who maybe in abusive relationships so that's wrong. That's morally wrong, the harm they've experienced. Will say, well, it really wasn't that bad, or he didn't really mean it, or he or she was having a bad day, and it really wasn't such a bad thing. So by minimizing the harm that has actually been done, we end up condoning that behavior. And so obviously that's not forgiveness, that forgiveness names something as wrong. As Robert Enright will say, it was wrong, it is wrong, it always will be wrong, but we're going to forgive anyway, right? Condoning basically is a way of dealing with moral wrongdoing that you end up condoning it when you tolerate it or minimize it. And so those are some of the cognate phenomena that oftentimes get mixed up with forgiveness. So as we try to think about forgiveness, it's important to recognize what forgiveness is and what forgiveness is not. And it's helpful to distinguish between things like mercy and pardon and excuse and condoning. So another important section in this entry is on the ends of forgiveness. That is, what are the goals of forgiveness. And there are three main goals that the article mentions, and as we'll see when we read through the books that we're going to look at, some authors emphasize one end while other authors emphasize other ends. So we'll just mention those three and recognize that not everybody sees them as equally weighted or even possible. So the first end or goal of forgiveness that they mention is reconciliation, right? It is often a goal that forgiveness tends towards or is hoping to lead towards. We forgive someone and we're also hoping to be reconciled with them. That is a restoring of the relationship or the wrongdoing. As we saw, reconciliation is a distinct concept or a distinct phenomenon from forgiveness, but oftentimes they're related in that forgiveness is something that we do on the way to reconciliation with the goal of achieving reconciliation. Okay, so that's one. The second end or goal of forgiveness is that it helps victims of wrongdoing move beyond the strong negative emotions that may harm them psychologically and physically. So a lot of the psychological literature about forgiveness is that, this anger, this resentment is eating me up. It's leading to depression and anxiety and even physical ailments. And so one of the goals of forgiveness is to help us overcome those negative emotions and the effects that it is having on our psychological and physical well-being. And the third end that the article mentions is to benefit wrongdoers. So forgiveness is done so that wrongdoers can feel a release from blame and from the bad feelings associated with the wrong they have done, so that they can themselves grow and be better off emotionally, physically, and spiritually. So those are the three ends that forgiveness or goals that forgiveness tries to achieve. Reconciliation, although it's not always possible, helping the victim move beyond sort of the strong negative emotions that's really harming them, and also to benefit the wrongdoers themselves. So another, I think, really important section in this entry is on the topic of who has standing to forgive, right? So if forgiveness is kind of meaningful in any way, a person who offers the forgiveness must have standing to forgive. So let's consider an extreme example to kind of see what we're talking about and see what we're not talking about. So the example is about someone who really wouldn't have standing to forgive. So consider somewhere, say in Australia, one person whom I don't know steals the car of another person whom I don't know. Now, if I'm, halfway around the world, I don't know anybody, I don't know the parties involved, and I say, I forgive the person who stole that person's car, it's really kind of pretty meaningless, right? I'm so removed from the situation. I'm a third party. I really have no standing to forgive. So in literature, it's kind of important to figure out, okay, who has standing to forgive and who doesn't when we talk about forgiveness. And so what I kind of want to do in this section is move from the person who is uncontroversial in their standing to forgive, and move further and further to some more controversial ideas about who has standing to forgive. So the most obvious and non-controversial, I suppose, is that the victim of wrongdoing has direct standing to forgive, right? So if I am a victim of a wrongdoing, if I'm a victim of an assault, for example, I am the one who has the choice whether to forgive or not, right? So in that case, it's pretty clear I have direct standing on whether to forgive the wrongdoing and the wrongdoer or not. Okay? Pretty obvious, I think. Second, though, it's kind of moving to the more controversial, is some people may be indirectly harmed by someone's wrongdoing, right? So the example that the essay gives is if someone lies to my friend, and that lie causes my friend to be late picking me up, leaving me, stranded in the rain, and I get cold, and I catch pneumonia, let's say, I'm indirectly harmed by the lie, right? He didn't lie to me directly, but he lied to my friend, and that lie caused him to leave me stranded, and I ended up catching pneumonia, let's say. So in this case, I may be said to have indirect standing to forgive. That is, I can choose to forgive the lie, even though it wasn't directly addressed to me or done to me, but I was indirectly harmed by that. So that's indirect standing to forgive. Okay. Another way in which people think about standing is in terms of proxy standing. Now, this is getting more controversial. That is, some people may have proxy standing to forgive on behalf of another person. And so the example given, and the examples often given are like this, so suppose someone's child has been assaulted, right, really badly, and can no longer communicate. That child can't communicate. Some think that a parent can forgive the offender in that close relative's stead. That is, my child's been assaulted and can't speak for themselves, but somehow I know that my child would want to forgive, would choose to forgive, and so therefore I can forgive that person who assaulted my child as their proxy in that case, right? So again, that's getting a bit more controversial whether anybody can proxy, but it would often be like I can be a proxy if I have some really close relationship. It's a spouse or a child or maybe a close friend that I feel as though, or that people feel as though actually can say what that person would want said. Now notice though, we have to make a distinction between proxy forgiveness, that is the forgiveness that one speaks on behalf of someone who can't speak for themselves, and the forgiveness that the parent may need to or choose to offer for the harm that was done to them because you harmed their child, right? Because not only did you harm the child in your physical violent assault, you also harmed the parent by robbing me of a relationship with my child, because you harmed them, it hurts me. Everybody knows that's the case. If someone killed my spouse or something like that, you have harmed me by robbing me of our future together, grandchildren, all these kinds of things. So here, the parent or the spouse has direct standing in relationship to the harm they have suffered and may or may not want to forgive that person. So proxy forgiveness is when I forgive on behalf of someone who can't do that for a variety of reasons, but that's different from I am also probably close enough that I've suffered harm, and then I have kind of just direct standing for that as well. So it's important to kind of sort these out correctly. And then the literature will often talk about third-party forgiveness, and this is the most controversial, that somehow third-party forgiveness would say that there's a person who's a wrongdoer and there's a person who's wronged, and I'm outside of that relationship, not even in a proxy relationship, not even in a relationship in which it's harmed, but I will somehow try to pronounce forgiveness of that person. Not many people kind of think this is appropriate. I guess it arises over the fact that some people are morally indignant when they see harm done to someone else, and then they might feel that they want to forgive that person somehow. But like I said, it gets to that point. Where do where's that line? Because, can I really forgive someone in Australia who stole the car of someone I don't know? Do I have any right to insert myself into that? So often people kind of pull back. It's the most controversial, and I actually think probably the most confused of the approaches to who has standing to forgive or not. So the next section of the entry deals with some major theories of forgiveness, and I'm going to mention some of them, not all of them, but some of them. So the first theory of forgiveness that is described are what the authors call emotion accounts, right? It's about how one feels about the wrongdoer. And so in this case, forgiveness is really kind of a change in the victim's emotions, right? So forgiveness involves overcoming some set of relevant negative emotions that happened in light of the wrongdoing, right? Resentment, hatred, rancor, hostility, or scorn. And so forgiveness will involve overcoming those negative emotions in some fashion. Now note, I just want to insert here that emotion accounts of forgiveness are compatible with belief that wrongdoers should be held accountable by recognized standards of justice, and in fact may need to be punished. So I can forgive a drunk driver, but I can also think that he or she should lose their license or pay a fine or go to jail, etc., right? So it's compatible. These theories are compatible. I can forgive and also say that that person should suffer some consequences and be punished. So the author kind of breaks these down into three minimal emotion accounts. So here, this approach says that in order to forgive, we need to overcome only a narrow set of negative emotions, right? Really kind of, to forgive, I just have to get over, my hostility to the person who did this to me and feelings of retribution that I really want to seek revenge. So if I can forgive, to forgive means I'm going to get over that hostility and that desire for revenge. That's minimal. Moderate emotional counts say that we should overcome not only sort of our hostile, revenge type feelings, but also overcome our moral anger or resentment. It's not just I want revenge, but also I really, really, really resent this person and it's eating me up. So moderate approaches say I should overcome that emotion as well. And expansive emotion accounts say that we should overcome all negative emotions associated with the wrongdoing and the wrongdoer. That's anger, hatred, loathing, contempt, indifference, disappointment, and sadness, right? Which is just, that'd be pretty hard. But so emotion accounts try to get over some set of negative emotions that are associated with the wrongdoing and that we feel towards the wrongdoer. So it goes from minimal ones where it's really kind of getting over the real hostility and desire for revenge to really the maximalist one that says I really should get rid of all negative emotions attached to the wrongdoing and the wrongdoer. Okay? So the second approach or second theory of forgiveness mentioned is what he says is our Butlerian accounts. Named after Bishop Joseph Butler. Bishop Joseph Butler was an Anglican Church of England bishop from 1692 to 1752, so it's good to know about Bishop Butler. Butler differs because he sees resentment at wrongdoing as what he says is both natural and innocent. That is, when we are morally harmed, when somebody does something wrong against us, our resentment tells us that shouldn't have happened, right? It's a way in which we say that was a wrongdoing. Our resentment tells us it was a wrongdoing, and it also affirms our dignity. It says, I'm a human being, and that should not have happened. So a certain amount of resentment or resentment is natural and innocent. And he also says it prevents future wrongdoing against him, right? A certain amount of resentment says, I am not going to let that happen to me again. And also, it motivates us to deter future wrongdoing to others through some kind of just punishment of the wrongdoer. So Butler begins by saying, actually, resentment is natural and innocent when we are harmed, for those reasons that I just mentioned. But, Butler says, excessive resentment can become dangerous. That is, when we let resentment get out of control, we can seek revenge, and we can seek to do harm to the person who punished us. And there, Bishop Butler thinks that goes against our obligations of benevolence that we have towards everyone, even wrongdoers. So for Butler, forgiveness involves two things. First, the forswearing of revenge, right? That's, we give up these ideas that we are going to be the ones to go out and directly harm this person in response and get back at them right that way. But then a moderating of resentment to an appropriate level, as I said. So resentment in and of itself is not wrong. It's only when it gets excessive. And so we moderate our resentment when we forgive. Okay, so that's Butler's account. The third approach that is mentioned is a punishment forbearance account. That is, here, this approach says forgiveness implicates or implies the forbearance of punishment, right? So this idea says if forgiveness means not holding someone accountable for a past wrong, then we can't punish them, because punishment is holding them accountable for a past wrong. Therefore, to forgive means that we should also forbear punishment or forbear our desire that they be punished. Note that this view is different from the first two because you can have an emotional account and say, no, sometimes people need to be taken care of in terms of appropriate standards of justice, and sometimes there will be punishment. And Butler certainly thought that was the case as well. But this view says, no, if you're really going to forgive someone, you ought to be also saying you want to forbear any punishment because you have said they shouldn't be accountable for their wrongdoing in the past anymore. And the fourth theory are multi-stage accounts. And so some people see sort of a two-stage process to forgiveness. And the first stage is sort of regaining a confidence in our own worth despite suffering wrongdoing, right? So when we suffer a wrongdoing, oftentimes it's an assault on our dignity, and we wonder, what's wrong, with us? So forgiveness is a way of overcoming that, right? By overcoming spite and malice and helping us transcend resentment. It kind of restores our dignity after this assault to our dignity that wrongdoing is. And then the second stage is, after we do that, we come to see the wrongdoer in a more favorable light, right? We recognize that they're not moral monsters. Maybe they have some context in their lives that explains, but doesn't excuse their behaviors, and we see them as in a more favorable light and someone who may be capable of reform and betterment and those kinds of things. So there are some other matters in this discussed in this entry that I'm not going to go into, and I'll just mention them briefly, and I'll tell you kind of why I'm not going to go into them. One is the topic of self-forgiveness, which is a pretty controversial topic, but we are going to look at that when we read Enright and Tutu's book. Divine forgiveness, like I said, there was only a few chapters, a few paragraphs on divine forgiveness in this entry. But when we get to Bash's book, he's a theologian. He's going to talk a lot about divine forgiveness, so we'll get to that. Political forgiveness, again, is the smaller section here. We're really not going to discuss that much in our time together in this class. You just can't get to everything. 2.2 has a little bit on political forgiveness. Griswold, in his book, has some significant sections on political forgiveness, but we just won't have time to get to those. Who knows, maybe if people want to keep going, we'll get to political forgiveness as well. And then forgiveness as a virtue. So a significant kind of approach to ethics these days is the recovery of a kind of a virtue ethics tradition that goes all the way back to Aristotle. And Griswold is part of that. His approach to forgiveness is an approach to forgiveness as a virtue. So I didn't want to kind of dig into what this entry does, because we'll look at that a lot more closely and in depth when we get to Griswold.